Hello, my name is Celeste from Black Metal Artists, and I'm here today with the person behind the project, Black Sanctum. Now to get started, you formed in 2024. What inspired the creation of this band, and I guess what vision did you have when starting this project?
It's actually kind of funny how Black Sanctum really started to begin with. I um I have another solo black metal project called Darkest, which has actually been around since the late 2000s. It actually formed in 2007.
Oh.
And I kind of had established an identity with Darkest that, I liked it and I liked the direction it was going, but then I was trying to do something a little more, I guess, more raw and more, straight to the point. And I started up Black Sanctum, which was initially supposed to be a side project. And what ended up happening was when I released the first EP, Enter Death, back in 2025, June of 2025, the reception and the response was so positive and so much more than what I had initially expected. And it actually did better than any of my other
Hmm.
releases for Darkest. So basically, I instead of doing what was going to be the third full length album of my other band, Darkest, I decided to make the next record the first LP for Black Sanctum by basically capitalizing on that momentum and that positive reception I had gotten from the Inner Death EP, and it just kind of shaped into a whole other entity that I found myself a lot more connected to than what I had with Darkest. And it all just kind of self perpetuated after I started writing and, building a network, building fans. And, what ended up coming out of that was this Terror Clandestine, which is the first LP. And um, it's definitely the first musical project I've ever done where I've actually felt 100% connected, and the messages and the energies that I'm trying to provoke have all been there, and it's natural. It doesn't feel like it's something that I'm forcing, and it's definitely taken on a life of its own. So I've just decided to kind of just keep on feeding the flames to that, and whatever else is supposed to come from it will continue to unravel as it should.
That's awesome. Yeah, I don't think I've really heard that before, where something like a side project becomes more of like a bigger thing. So that's really awesome to hear. Now your music blends a bit of like black and death metal. How do you kind of balance the aggression of death metal and more of like the darkness of black metal in your sound?
It actually kind of came kind of like what I was explaining previously, because, I've always been black metal all the way, as far as straight traditional blast beat, song structure, production, and, all that good stuff. And that was another thing I kind of started to do a little different with Black Sanctum, was trying to be a little more open-minded and not so specifically set on a black metal atmosphere. And when I was actually writing the music, instead of, kind of almost like following a code or whatever you want to call it, I decided to kind of integrate a little more openness to, bringing in elements from, more like death metal, and just churning together the two genres. And, it's actually kind of funny because I wasn't intentionally trying to make it, I guess, what you would consider a black and death metal band. It just sort of kind of happened on its own. And, after I've released the record, Terror Clandestine, I see a lot of people, classifying as black and death metal, which was not anywhere near my intentions whatsoever when I was actually, creating the record or whatnot. Um, but it's definitely opened up a new realm for, bringing in more melodic material and kind of provoking that, I guess, what you consider to be like a magical type of atmosphere, and not just blatant, traditional, straightforward, open chords, blast beats. The melodic stuff really, I think, brings out the energies and, I guess, the dark divine, what I'm trying to express with the music itself. And I found it to be the two to go really hand in hand. And once I started really getting into my zone and getting into my groove with writing, it just sort of happened naturally and just self perpetuated. And I think that was another thing I've never experienced before with any kind of songwriting is, instead of spending, sometimes days, weeks at a time trying to perfect a melody or a riff or, eventually a song, I would get behind my guitar and, it was almost like something else was writing the music for me. I can't really explain it, but it's definitely worked out very well for my best interest without a doubt.
Yeah, that's cool. Especially because like a lot of people like their favorite, like if they're really into black metal, they also like death metal. I could definitely say that for myself. So it's a nice mesh to have because how many people like it hand in hand. Um,
Absolutely.
so your themes revolve around like death worship, Satanism, darkness. Now what philosophical artistic ideas influence your lyrical direction?
You know, it's something that I started with my other band, Darkest, which I'm a recovering drug addict, and I spent a lot of time living in homelessness on the streets. And before then, I would consider myself to be, I guess, an atheist,
Mhm.
and I didn't really believe in any kind of higher power whatsoever. But as I started to kind of get deeper and deeper into that, dark ass abyss that exists within active addiction, I started to get into contact with some sort of a nefarious force that I look now as being, you know, satanic energies, demonic entities. And I very much experienced that firsthand where, before I always used to think it was total bullshit. I when I first started listening to black metal, the whole Satan thing, I just kind of looked at it like a gimmick and, still like the music, don't get me wrong. But it wasn't until I actually started living the experience and feeling these forces literally at my fingertips that I really started to understand the perception that there is actually another side to all this. And, that kind of led me down to doing more research into the occult, looking into a lot of teachings of the Temple of the Black Light, which is something I follow, formerly known as the misanthropic Luciferian order started by John of Dissection. It's
Mm.
something I've really involved myself with, and that's really played a role in songwriting and, learning the ideology and learning, the teachings and the rituals and whatnot. And what I've done with Black Sanctum is I found a way to channel both the energies that I dealt with living in active addiction, and channeling that darkness and those malevolent forces into music and trying to make it into like, a manifestation or a vessel for this very type of energy. Um, so that is a very big part of it. Death worship. I dealt with death very, very much frequently when I was living on the streets. I had several people I used with. They were die or they would die off or people would get murdered. I've even dealt with death a few times myself from drug overdose. And, just until you get that close to death itself, I guess what you consider to be the Grim Reaper, it's as close as you'll ever get without physically touching it. And then, you're gone, you're on the other side. And trying to invoke that very same feelings that I would get in those times. And, at first I was a lot of people, you would think you would be terrified of it and want to run from it. Whereas me personally, I was enthralled by it, and I actually that's what I seeked anytime I would get into a deep binge or that whole lifestyle. But eventually, there towards the end, I think that's actually what has led me to being clean today. Was I started to actually get afraid of being that close, and I think that was basically my will to live was restored. So instead of going back to living as a drug addict and going back to living that life of just total chaos, lawlessness, the whole 9 yards. I've used Black Sanctum as my way to both channel those energies, invoke those energies, and basically authenticating the dark divine and whatnot without having to physically do something like sticking a needle in my arm or whatever. And then, of course, it wouldn't be considered black metal with, I kind of top it off as like the final ingredient with, imagery, song titles, lyrics, of course. So that's basically what I've tried to do, especially when it comes to writing song lyrics. I use those experiences and kind of integrate that with, the whole Temple of the Black Light wordage, vocabulary, and all that good stuff. And the results come out to being pretty pretty spot on for what I was aiming for.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. I more power to you. And I definitely respect that you got yourself clean and used it as like a different outlet and stuff to do music and stuff instead. Because I know it can be super hard, especially with how tempting it is to relapse and stuff. So I highly
Absolutely.
respect you for that.
Thank you.
Um, Now, in 2025, you released obviously several works, including Relapse, Darkness Death, Inner Death, and the singles Bruticent Haze and Luciferian. Now, how do these singles, I guess, shape the evolution of your project?
So, the first thing you mentioned, the Relapse Darkness Death, that was kind of that's an EP that has it's like a compilation of a few different, I guess, demos or whatever that
Mhm.
I put together. Actually, I think within the last 5 years, there was nothing really that has like an actual substance to it. It was basically just me releasing something to kind of establish Black Sanctum as an identity or whatever. And that I wanted to release it as a demo, but it's kind of funny because Metal Archives does not allow, I guess, demos to be your first official publicated release on the
Mhm.
website. So that's what I basically just consider to be my first EP or whatever. And it's a lot of like rehearsals, experimentation. There's instrumentals, different types of productions or whatnot. So it's a pretty, I guess, a special release if you want to call it that. Um, and then, of course, Inner Death come out in 2025, which is the first EP I did. And kind of goes back to what I was saying before, when I think it's the first question, talking about how Black Sanctum was started. Immediately after I finished the Inner Death EP, I was originally going to start doing the third full length record for Darkest. And since I had decided to, focus on the momentum built behind Inner Death, I decided to do a first full length for Black Sanctum. And the first track, Protestant Haze, was actually the first single on the actual album, Terror Clandestine. And I released that in September. And I had, anticipated, I had the release date set for March 13th, well in advance when I first started writing the album. And as a way to kind of continue building that momentum, because nowadays, especially in the black metal world, if you get momentum, if you get people listening, you get people following, you have to do whatever you can to keep that on the positive side. Because anytime you start to lose that momentum, it's very hard to get it to come back up. So what I did essentially was Protested Haze, I released as a single, both to continue building the momentum that was started in Enter Death, and also to kind of, I guess, kickstart the countdown or whatever you want to call it for Terror Clandestine, the record as a full. And, even with that single, like the reception from that alone, I was just blown away with it. It definitely got a lot more positive feedback than I had initially expected. And it kind of just, picks up off where Inner Death left off. And that momentum, in fact, did exactly what I was intending it to do. And it just kept growing and growing and rising and rising. So, and then on Christmas, and I chose Christmas Day specifically to release Luciferion, which is basically an ode to Lucifer, and I thought it would be pretty clever as a mocking to release it on Christmas Day, which that too also had very, very positive results and got a lot of positive feedback. And it that song especially, I remember when I was doing the vocals for it, like I can remember specifically being in the vocal booth or whatever, because I also produce all of my music. I record, master, mix, engineer, the whole 9 yards. And before any other project I would do, like, because vocals are always the last thing that I do. It's kind of like the final ritual or whatever you want to call it. And I remember finally, being dialed into that and feeling 100% connected and 100% in a different reality or in a different mindset. And when I go back and listen to that song now, it when you go back and you listen to it and you don't recognize your own voice, that's when you know you're doing something right. And that those two singles definitely continued the momentum onwards. And then, finally in March, a couple weeks ago when I first released Terror Clandestine, it's basically just taken that same momentum and just continued to skyrocket and continues getting the results that I've been looking for.
Well, it's great to hear. I hope that you keep having that momentum. Now regarding your new album that you've mentioned, what concept or message stands behind this album?
Again, it translates to Terror Clandestine is basically the wordage of bringing to life and bringing into physical form the very existence of evil, demonic, and spiritual entities that basically exist along this same spiritual realm that we exist in today. Like, a lot of people misconceive the spiritual realm to be some land far, far fucking away beyond the stars, beyond everything. But in reality, it exists right here before us in this very same dimension. And basically, what that is basically penetrating into that spiritual realm, through means of self destruction or, ritual, drug use, sleep deprivation, or, all of the above. And, basically seeing, feeling, hearing, and, communicating with these energies that literally exist right before us, right before our very eyes, but only certain ones can feel or communicate with this spiritual realm or whatever. So the Terror Clandestine, that's basically what that symbolizes as, as a wordage or whatever. And it it's something I had started in Darkest with my other band, but I've just decided to continue building on what's worked for me, and I've found that to kind of be like my MO. And why go anywhere different, and stick to what works. And that's what Terror Clandestine eventually shaped into. And it's my way of trying to bring to the world this very experience and the existence of the dark divine that really is not bullshit. And that's a thing a lot of black metal bands lack. I think most bands are just a bunch of people that get together and dress up, play makeup, and say like, oh, saint that and this and that. Where I've always found black metal to be something that is much more powerful, and it's more than just the music, because anybody can get behind a drum set, play a guitar, scream into a vocal or scream into a microphone. And that's something I've always strongly believed in. And to be a black metal artist and be a black metal musician, the music is just half of the battle. And it's about authenticating the very thing that black metal was originally founded on, back in the 1990s, what was going over in Scandinavia, and how everything then shaped what black metal came to being. And there's very few bands nowadays that I listen to that I know have that same feeling or have that same mentality. So I've found that to be very, very important with my music, is trying to, bring more life to the songs themselves, and not just as a physical sound that you listen to. I try to provoke, I guess, demonic or black magical feelings and energies to the listener. And it's definitely working, because every release I've had before, especially in the early days, I would go back and listen. And now, really, I listen like, holy fuck, that sounds terrible. Like, what the fuck was I thinking? And then now it's a whole entire different, result. And when I go back and listen to Terror Clandestine, it's something I'm very proud of, and it's something that I can, 100% be willing to present to others and to present to other people in the black metal community, and actually praise it with substance behind the words and whatnot. So yeah, it's I guess it's what I would try to consider to be my MO ultimately with Black Sanctum. It is just trying to be a vessel, and I guess total opposition and in everything, and almost like opposition within opposition, because it's trying to be an opposing force to the black metal world itself. Because like I said, there's so many bands, like especially on Spotify now, you go on there and you see all these black metal bands, and there's nothing that draws you into them, and you just go and listen. It's just the same old shit. And it's all about standing out and establishing an identity so that you can be memorable and you can be known within this type of genre.
Yeah, definitely. I think you said it pretty well for sure. Especially with views and stuff that people have, stuff you can read about as far as like the history and different like philosophies with black metal and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
So yeah. Now as far as your songwriting goes, what's your process for it? And do you typically begin with like riffs or atmosphere or like lyrical concepts?
That's a very good question. It's something that I kind of do a little bit of everything with like what you just mentioned there. But
Mhm.
if I had to say an actual, like, 100%, this is how I do it every single time. It usually it'll start with a riff. Like, I'll come up with something, and I usually call it like an embryo or a zygote, which essentially just means the beginning of a new life, or, in this case, the song. And what I usually do is I'll record it, and I'll go back and I'll listen to it, and I meditate on it. And, naturally, after you start listening to it enough, especially for me, I mean, it could be different for any other artist, but I found myself like almost an impulsive response. Like, I'll start conjuring up other ideas or other melodies or other riffs that kind of builds around that idea. And, being a producer is also a very big part of it, because I have the access to, record demos, or, just riffs, drums, guitar, and I can go back and listen to it. And I basically just start building on that. And then eventually, it eventually builds into an entire song or whatnot. Another thing that I do is I'm very, very big on meditating, and, trying to get myself to dialed in completely to that atmosphere, kind of like what I was sharing previously. And I allow basically my subconscious to kind of take over, and then I'll start having melodies kind of just, manifest themselves, and I'll hum those out. And then I'll actually go back and I'll record my like humming and what it comes into. And then I just basically take that and translate that into guitar riffs. And I found that to be the most effective because I feel like that is the most connected method to channel or to get into that, I guess, astral realm or, level of existence. And it's basically just deep, deep meditation. And when I put that into physical form, it's not just trying to jam a guitar and saying, okay, I could do this. And, a lot of people try to be all technical and, say, hey, look what I can do here. I found, especially with black metal, it's all about feeling, it's all about emotion. And when I have these ideas stem from my subconscious, and I, physically translate them into the form of music, I find that to be the most, personable and I guess genuine or whatnot. And so I do that as far as the actual music composition. As far as lyric writing, I, there for a long time, especially in the early days, I lyrics always kind of seem to be the most challenging part of the process for me because personally I'm a very, very good writer. I love to write like reviews, novels. I write stories about my times at addiction, but I used to always struggle with writing lyrics because i I had the inspiration, I had the ideas, but I could never put it into the words that I would think would be fitting for the music. But here recently, especially with this last album, I finally started learning a way that actually worked for me. And basically, what I do is every night, even to this day, that I've kind of taken a little bit of a break from writing music to kind of let this new release, I guess, digest or whatever. But I found just writing every single night, whether or not if it's just a sentence, a verse, or anything. And then eventually, as time progresses, all that starts to pile up, and then you're like, okay, well, I kind of just go and I pick from different excerpts and then assemble them by, I guess, the same idea or whatnot. Or, in other cases, I've had songs where, that inspiration really hits hard and I'm in tune, I'm dialed in, and I can write a whole entire song within, like an entire, like just in one session. Um, but something else, and I've actually tried to start doing this a little more often, is trying to start the other way around and start
Mm.
with lyrics. So that way it would kind of be more challenging to really pick and point or pick apart different types of like music to that go along with the lyrics. I've read a lot of artists who do it that way, and I used to think it would be a little too much to get into, but I it's something I'm really going to try to start challenging myself to do with like future material. But for the most part, how I just explained it, that's pretty much the way I go about songwriting process. And I'll listen to it and say, okay, maybe I need to add this here, take this out. I found that the more you listen to like demos, it makes life so much easier when you go to physically record the actual album or whatnot. So it's definitely something that being a producer helps out a lot with, is because a lot of people who aren't producers don't have that same luxury that they can go back and take their music with them everywhere. I have my earbuds in anywhere I go, and if I'm not listening to podcasts or other bands, I'm listening to my own music and always thinking of ways and means that I can improve it, grow it, change it, etc. And it's definitely worked out very well.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I appreciate the explanation of the whole process and stuff. Especially how different it is for you, and especially with your perspective of being a producer. It's interesting. Now I'm actually curious about this because of where I used to live, and now where I live now, comparison wise. Now the underground metal scene in North Carolina has its own identity, definitely. Has the local scene influenced your music or the way that you approach your project at all?
The current project, no, not really. But you are absolutely right. I did, when that scene in North Carolina was at its peak, which was like in the late 2000s,
Mhm.
I was very much active. I went to shows very, very frequently. And, I even tried to start, I guess, a deathcore band or whatever you want to call it.
Mhm.
But it's so crazy in a lot of ways because that scene literally just it died overnight, just out of nowhere. And it went
Mhm.
from being something so profound and something so like just vibrant. Like I used to have so much fucking fun at those shows. You would go to, and they were always in like those smaller venues. If you go there, you better get ready to come out with you might get your nose busted, your lip busted, and just that constant sense of you know, chaos during any show you go to. Now, if I would say that would probably be the one thing if I were to choose anything from those times that I do try to, integrate in my own music, but it's not so much in a live setting, since I'm a one man band, even though I would one day like to maybe try
Mhm.
to put together a band to do a live set, but, just chaos and the sense of going to a show and feeling a sense of like danger or being scared, like that's why I love bands like Watain. When I first saw them in 2010 in Atlanta, I will never forget just how like terrified the fucking audience looked. And that's something that's stuck with me ever since, because that danger and fear, I think, are two of the biggest, most important factors of black metal. You want people to be afraid. You want people to feel out of their skin. You don't want them necessarily to say, "Oh, I just absolutely love life, this and that, blah blah blah." But you want to either have your audience be completely in tune with what you're doing, or you want to look in their eyes and just see the ever living fucking shit scared out of them, which is
Mhm.
something I very much have adapted into my own music as well. But those scene days, they very well did play a lot, with my own personal. The first band I ever joined was actually a deathcore band, and we didn't get very far. Obviously, I played bass. Um, so that kind of established the musicianship for me, and like being an artist, and the desire to continuing building as an actual musician and not just somebody who plays in a bedroom on nights or whatever. um, but now, I mean, there are a few. I wouldn't say it's enough to be considered a scene, but there are a few like black metal bands in the area where I live, which is like the Charlotte, North Carolina area. They are black metal bands, but it's I wouldn't say there's probably no more than I don't know, maybe three or four, and
Mhm.
it's in no way comparable to what it was like in the 2000s with the metalcore scene. But
Mhm.
definitely a very fun time to live. I will say that.
Interesting. That kind of as like a final question here. Where can people find you and your music, and what are your future plans?
Alrighty. So right now, Black Sanctum is available on Spotify, Bandcamp, YouTube, Pandora, Amazon, iTunes, Apple. If you go anywhere, basically type in on Google Black Sanctum, I'm gonna pop up. And I've been doing that. That's been probably I think the most fun part of this entire process is, after the completion of the actual production and, after the release and promoting and getting the word out and kind of going into that uncertainty of knowing what the results, like you could either get this type of reception or you can get this type of reception, just as long as it's progress. I found progress to be the most essential part, especially being a DIY artist or whatever. But the music's it's easily accessible. Spotify, I think, and Bandcamp are the two biggest platforms where a
Hmm.
lot of my listeners come from. Um, Now, as far as future plans, as I do everything else in life, I take everything one day at a time. Nothing's super premeditated, and whatever I feel when opportunity presents itself, and that I know that's what needs to be done, that's what I pursue. So right now I'm just kind of, letting this release digest. Um, I have been talking to a few record labels as far as, possible collaborations, and that's definitely very, very exciting. So it's all about growth, and it's all about progress, and not trying to have too much expectations. It's just I found my personal motto to be try to establish an identity that differs from the others, because you could very well get very lost easily with the amount of DIY black metal bands that exist nowadays, especially with how far technology has progressed and advanced with you know um, like you could literally have a studio right at your desktop, but it's all about knowing what to do with those tools, which is something I stick very strong to, and learning how to perfect, or perfect to the best of my ability or whatnot. So I um I have a very good gut feeling. I don't know what's going to come about from everything, but I definitely do have a very strong positive feeling of what's to come for Black Sanctum, and I just gotta stick with it and keep doing what I do, and everything else will present itself when it's supposed to.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Absolutely.
And I wish you the best of luck in your future endeavors.
Thank you very much for having me.